Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. I'm Florence Reed. You might have noticed that the UK is having rather a rough week. Riots have spread from Southport across the country and civil unrest is expected to continue throughout the summer. Just a few days ago, Freddie spoke to our own Aris Rousinos, who was on the ground in Belfast reporting on the violence there. All in all, things feel quite chaotic, but one man's chaos is another man's political opportunity, and previous examples tell us a story on this, just like the pandemic, which proved a crisis moment can allow government to bypass normal processes under the guise of emergency action. But when the crisis ends, we don't seem to go back to normal. Quite the opposite. A new normal is created, and this seems like it might be one of those moments. Joining me in the studio today, I am pleased to say, is Silkie Carlo. She is the director of the British civil liberties NGO Big Brother Watch, an expert in all things deep state and surveillance, and very much a friend of the show. Welcome to UnHerd, Silkie.
Thank you.
So amongst some very alarmist headlines about civil war coming to this country, Keir Starmer has addressed the nation and laid out some new plans for policing and surveillance that I know you'll be very interested in.
I can announce today that following this meeting, we will establish a national capability across police forces to tackle violent disorder. These thugs are mobile, they move from community to community, and we must have a policing response that can do the same. Shared intelligence, wider deployment of facial recognition technology, and preventative action, criminal behaviour orders to restrict their movements before they can even board a train, in just the same way that we do with football hooligans. And let me also say to large social media companies and those who run them, violent disorder clearly whipped up online, that is also a crime. It's happening on your premises, and the law must be upheld everywhere.
So can you just lay out exactly what he promised in that speech?
Thankfully, we are absolutely nowhere near civil war. What we're seeing is a minority of people who have really just thrown the mask off and shown themselves and are causing fear and terror in some communities across the country. But it will change policing, and I think it could change the landscape for civil liberties for some time in this country. It's one of those moments that we will not row back from because things have changed so substantially. This will change everything. And there are two aspects of the Prime Minister's response that are particularly notable from a civil liberties perspective. One being the promise to expand facial recognition surveillance in the country, and the other being moves towards online censorship.
Let's start with the facial recognition then, because that's obviously something that we've spoken about before on this channel. Tell us what the situation is now when it comes to facial recognition, and what could it be in the coming weeks if this new legislation is allowed through?
Well, first of all, there is no legislation. Keir Starmer is just saying that he's backing the police to use live facial recognition, and that is the status quo, that there is no legislation. This is police taking a new AI surveillance tool and just experimenting with it. At the moment, that has been sporadic across a number of different forces, but it's been particularly in Cardiff and in London by the Metropolitan Police. We recently initiated legal action against the Metropolitan Police's use of live facial recognition, which we are very sure is unlawful. So it is concerning to see a former human rights lawyer so casually suggest something like rolling out live facial recognition. We don't know exactly what is being promised here. But also that's disturbing because when you have an announcement like that, it reads like a blank cheque. It's a signal to police forces that in general, you have the highest level of political support to use one of the most extreme surveillance capabilities that exists in the world. And to give people a picture of that, this is something that is used in China. It's not something that is used in the democratic world. It was, in fact, on the day of Keir Starmer's announcement that live facial recognition would be used as a response, or facial recognition, he said, would be used as a response to the horrendous scenes of violence that we've seen. On the very same day, the EU AI Act came into force, which broadly prohibits live facial recognition because it's such a threat to democracy, and that is recognised across the continent of Europe.
What distinguishes live facial recognition then from your standard CCTV process?
We think that Keir Starmer was talking about live facial recognition because he spoke about wider deployments, which suggests that this is something we'll see across the country. He also spoke about stopping people getting on trains. That suggests something like a technology that is situated in places where millions of people pass through that is checking their identities as they walk past. And that's essentially what live facial recognition is. It's a camera that assesses your face biometrically. So think of when you go through an automated passport control and you stand and you get scanned. That's happening, but without you necessarily even knowing that a camera's there. And without your consent, every single person that passes by the camera will have their face scanned. And if you are someone that the police have decided that they're interested in, then the police might get an alert on a device and come and speak to you. It's highly inaccurate. So far across the life course of police in the UK using live facial recognition, 74% of their match alerts have actually been misidentifications, people that weren't the person that the police thought that they were.
Not a great hit rate, is it really?
Not at all. And especially when you're thinking about these high-pressured riot situations, where you've got dogs and horses and batons and shields. The idea of bringing AI surveillance software into this picture when everyone's masked up, I mean, it's really ridiculous. And I think that poses the question of what will the impact of this really be and who will it really affect? And once this has died down, and it will die down, having opened these floodgates, who is really going to pay the price for this dive in civil liberties? The other use of facial recognition is called retrospective facial recognition. And that is where you can kind of use facial recognition like a forensic tool. So let's say you have an image of somebody who's trying to burn down a hotel. You can take that image and search for that person's face against another database. There are lots of different ways of doing that. You can do it against a criminal database, so the police national database, which is images of suspects and convicts.
So you could take an image, a still from one of these riots, and then search it against a list of mugshots, for example.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's still a big list. It's about 13 to 19 million images at any one time. It's a big list. But the other end of the spectrum, it's the lower end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum is that you can search faces against, for example, all viewable images on the internet.
So this includes everybody's Facebook images.
All of us.
Any image that you've shared on the internet becomes data for this machine to search for you. So who will be suffering the consequences of this then? You mentioned there that it perhaps won't be used against the people who those who support this idea might expect it to be used against in future. So who will it down the line be used against?
That's the question we should now all be asking. And because of the flippant way, frankly, in which the Prime Minister has made this announcement, we have no reassurance about what the answer to that question is. But I can say anyone who thinks that these kinds of extreme surveillance technologies are going to be restricted to the people that they don't like, or to rioters and thugs, is for the birds. So far already, we've seen live facial recognition used on high streets, around protests, anti-arms fair protests, where you don't have the far right throwing petrol bombs and so on. It has the potential to be a crossing of the Rubicon for surveillance in the country. I would not be raising the alarm had some reassurance been given. But so far, the approach that we're seeing is the blank check approach. There isn't even a law restricting the use of or permitting the use of live facial recognition. In fact, Parliament has never even debated it. It's 2024.
So this is almost a super legal process. This is happening without any legislation even coming to pass. There is no question within the court system as to whether or not this is legal. It is beyond that at this point.
Well, the police are relying on a patchwork, what they describe as a patchwork of different laws. They're saying they're invoking common law powers. They're saying, but the Data Protection Act bears some influence. They're even saying the Human Rights Act helps us to govern how we use this. Our assessment, and with our legal team, our assessment is that the way that facial recognition is currently being used is unlawful. And that's why we're bringing a legal challenge.
So the other element of Keir Starmer's speech was, of course, about preventative action and the idea of preventative policing, which is something that is very controversial, but to many might seem like a reassuring prospect, the idea that before someone commits a crime, they would be apprehended.
They, of course, mustn't stray into predictive policing before, pre-crime would be ridiculous. Also, there's simply no need. There is so much out there with people openly threatening violence in the streets and on the internet. These are offences. And where we start to get worried is where we hear the state starting to attribute more attention to things that aren't offences, because that's not where the focus should be.
What would that be? What are the examples in this context?
Well, so for example, we're now hearing that the Counter Disinformation Unit is going to be revived, and is going to be...
An old friend of the show.
Yeah, or a foe of the show.
Good to see them back.
Yeah. And they've got a new name. So now they're called the National Security Online Information Team.
Even less catchy than the original.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Kind of imagine like caps and jackets and stuff. But it's a deceptive name because their remit is not restricted to national security whatsoever. And
what will the new remit be?
We know that they're now being tasked to the current situation, the riots and the social unrest that's happening right now. And they can be tasked to anything that the government really tasks them to. It's our understanding that they were looking at electoral misinformation. So they're looking at elections. They were looking at Ukraine, Gaza and Israel. So they look at the hot topics really of the day, just like the Counter Disinformation Unit did, of course, during COVID, where we uncovered its incredibly censorial kind of thought crime type activities. So to see this unit revived and more public resources going into non-crime is, concerning. Again, there's no reassurance that this is going to be a sensible project. Just at the end of the Conservative government, the Culture Committee in Parliament said, having reviewed the evidence, and we've been pushing evidence into Parliament for a long time about this now, they said that the unit needs to be subject to a full independent investigation and review. That hasn't happened. So as far as we know, it's the same people, it's the same legacy, it's the same unit that was spying on journalists, monitoring human rights campaigners, parliamentarians during the pandemic, maligning them in reports for things that they were saying that were true because they were critical of government about government pandemic management. Mm-hmm. And that is a whole spectrum of people from, David Davis questioning vaccine passports and lockdown modelling, all the way to Caroline Lucas questioning Boris Johnson's relationship with the truth, for example.
I think we might have been on a few of those lists.
I'm
actually.
sure. Yeah, exactly.
I can imagine we probably appeared a few times.
I had a few pages in there. And nothing that we found when we were looking at this was untrue. And yet this all happens under the banner of countering mis and disinformation.
Should this cause kind of red alarm signals to us that this is a moment like COVID in which the law is not being properly upheld and things are happening without people really knowing, and that we might enter into what I described there in the introduction as a kind of new normal, as happened after the pandemic?
I'm concerned about things that in the heat of this moment when democracy is under threat, that some of the government's response might further actually erode our democratic values and practices, and doing things like introducing authoritarian mass surveillance or social media surveillance of non-crimes is one of those examples of something it's very hard to roll back. We've just been doing it for 2 years with the Counter Disinformation Unit. But it's very, very easy to slip in a time of crisis. And in times of crisis, politicians don't always think clearly. So, one of the difficulties that we have with the Counter Disinformation Unit, rebranded now, is that it's so opaque. We don't know. It's almost more opaque than some of the security services. There's a committee in Parliament called the Intelligence and Security Committee, which has a high level of clearance, and they analyse the activities of GCHQ, MI5, MI6. They're not allowed to look at the Counter Disinformation Unit. It's quite chilling. And given what we found when we were able to get documents out, that politicians were being spied on, journalists were being spied on. In fact, disinformation about journalists was being spread by the Counter Disinformation Unit. For example, Julia Hartley-Brewer, because she opposed the idea of mandatory vaccines in schools. A memo was sent about her being a vaccine skeptic to 65 government units, which she isn't. That was unlawful to do that. So, there's something shady and spooky about this unit. If what they think they're doing is legitimate, open it up to scrutiny. If they're there to protect democracy, practice what you preach and be open and democratic about it. I do think one thing that's really important is that there is actual policing online, just as there is offline. There are lots of crimes happening online. You've got fraud, you've got stalking, you've got these criminal threats of violence. And I believe that the Home Office is doing some of that. And we are seeing some prosecutions now for some of these horrendous cases of people issuing very immediate, direct threats, which are not protected by the right to free speech, obviously.
But there has been this intermingling or a kind of grey area that's happened between cybercrime and then just the world of social media, the marketplace of ideas, you might call it, the town square of Twitter. And what's happening there feels like it's become quite blurred. And even if it's speech you might vehemently disagree with and in fact abhor, the right to speak freely on social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter is different to the cyber criminal activities of someone perpetrating fraud or stalking online. And that's the problem here, I suppose, is that we do have this slightly tricky situation in the case of these riots where a lot of the organising of the riots is happening on social media platforms. We know that Tommy Robinson, who was booted from Twitter and then brought back on by Elon Musk, has been a major figure in inspiring a lot of the action that's happened on the streets in the last few weeks. I don't think that's particularly controversial to say, even though he is himself not in the country. So how do we deal with that? Because that feels like a difficult, contentious problem at the heart of this combination of cyber criminals and just people exercising free speech online. How do we cope with that grey area?
It's a difficult one. I think how we cope with it is by having very clear, bright red lines around what is lawful and what is unlawful. There absolutely are some people who have been posting online immediate direct threats of violence or inciting violence. That's an offence. That's clear under British law that it's an offence. It's not protected by the right to free speech. And of course, the reason is we can see the consequence, that people are now being injured and hurt. The other end of the spectrum, the grey area, is what confuses people, also inflames tensions, because then people say, but I can't say what I want to say. And they think that the only way that they can communicate is to commit violence. And that's not the case.
So in some way, the suppression of free speech can lead to more violence. I think this is something that people also find quite difficult to comprehend, because, of course, by blocking Tommy Robinson, you do see a decrease in the amount of public support for him. He effectively disappeared from public life for a long time because of being banned from Twitter. Allowing him back on has, anyone would admit who's kind of got a kind of rational mindset, must have contributed to the situation that we're in now in terms of the inflaming of these ideas on the streets of Britain.
I think the case of Tommy Robinson is slightly more straightforward, really, in that he has so consistently committed offences, including through communications. So, for example, the film that he's been screening recently, which he's not permitted to screen by the court because it spreads heinous, libelous lies about a vulnerable child. This is the kind of thing that really no one in their right mind would say is protected by free speech, even by the First Amendment, even if you take an absolutist view on free speech. Drawing the line on where somebody is criminally culpable and where their speech isn't protected is a fine line to draw. And that's really, in my mind, where the attention should be, is on the communications offences that exist. And often that is around inciting violence, and there's a direct relationship there. The fact that so much time was wasted when we were looking at the Online Safety Act, which has now, this is the new framework that really governs content on the internet. The fact that so much time was spent on that, obsessing about legal but harmful speech that wasn't really part of any kind of judicial process and wasn't part of any kind of criminal process, but that foreign companies would then be obliged to do something about. It was so woolly. It was such a missed opportunity. When you've got literally millions of people posting images of child sex abuse onto the internet. Nothing was in that bill about joining up law enforcement and making sure that the kind of protections that people would expect in the physical public square that they would get on the internet. Instead, it became about, really, frankly, this whole conversation about legal but harmful was about information control to some degree. And definitely that's what we saw during COVID that something like the Counter Disinformation Unit, which purported to be about keeping people safe, was about keeping politicians safe and keeping them immune from criticism, because the things that we saw in reports time and time again were lawful, accurate speech that rightly criticised politicians, sometimes wrongly, but quite often rightly. And that is all legitimate speech, lawful speech that should be nowhere near the crosshairs of state censorship and reporting.
At the very beginning of this situation, a week or so ago in Southport, when the attack happened that kicked all of these riots off, a fake name was produced on Twitter that made the person who had committed these terrible stabbings appear to be Muslim. It was purposefully done to stoke hatred against Muslims. That is a good example of misinformation. But of course, it's not illegal to do that. It doesn't help probably that someone like Elon Musk is getting in the fray of the culture war on this, given that he is kind of supposed to be the sensible voice at the top of Twitter. But what do we do about that? That idea of misinformation, actual misinformation, like in that case, can cause terrible harm, but it is not illegal. So where does that fit into this puzzle?
I have a bit of there's clearly a relationship. It's part of, that misinformation is part of the ecosystem of racist rhetoric online, which led to the violence that we're now seeing. But I dispute that it's causal in any way. And I've been frankly quite shocked to see some groups like actually maybe not shocked, disappointed to see some groups like the Centre for Countering Digital Hate throw out these op-eds days later saying that American social media giants have caused this violence by allowing the misinformation. My response to that is to say, first of all, a single lie or mistruth cannot make someone go and set fire to Shoe Zone. Okay, like the idea of this being a direct relationship is frankly absurd. This has tapped into clearly a kind of underbelly of simmering racism in the country, Islamophobia, and racial tensions that frankly a lot of us probably didn't fully appreciate existed to the extremity that it's now presenting itself. But the question I would ask is, had the attacker then been a Muslim, or had he been someone that had just arrived on a small boat, or had he been an immigrant to the country, which he isn't, would that then, are the people who are saying the misinformation caused it, would the violence then have been justified or any more expected?
Yeah, what is the opposite of misinformation?
Yeah.
Does that actually legitimise violence in that case? And unfortunately, this is where we stray again, to repeat the many sins of COVID, into a kind of for thee but not for me kind of idea, which would be that when my enemies are spreading misinformation, then it is misinformation. But when I am spreading misinformation, it is for a good cause, or if it turns out to be true, then it was never bad anyway. And so this kind of mental gymnastics that can occur. We seem to have gone back in time here a little bit. Do you sense that we've slightly U-turned as a culture on our scepticism that we once had about this woolly idea of misinformation?
I think it's a risk, and that's why we're raising the alarm now and saying, look at what's happened before, think really carefully and really seriously about this, and make sure that the right parameters are in place. Lots of people in the Labour Party, lots of senior people in the Labour Party do not have strong instincts on free speech, to put it that way.
Which is a shame, given that the left did used to be the kind of centre for the idea of free speech on the political spectrum.
Absolutely. You cannot have social progress without free speech. Society completely fossilises if you don't have people able to openly and freely share ideas, challenge each other, and move the dial forwards. So, but the thing is, the people that don't want free speech are always the people with power. And so it's always an indicator of where power lies. And I think that's why the counter misinformation package is so easy to reach for by elites that, to be honest, never really trusted the general public with free and open access to information, and that always has an instinct to want to try to choke information among the public, particularly on the internet where it's so unrestricted. And that kind of sensorial elitist instinct is a very easy one to reach to, but it also makes it very dangerous, because in times like this, everyone will be saying, do something. We're looking around us and seeing this chaos, seeing an unrecognisable country in these scenes, which of course limited, but it is shocking, and people want a reaction. And it's in these kinds of circumstances that we can do real damage to democracy with things like curbs on free speech.
I expect Keir Starmer, as well of anyone, would be keen to show that he's tough on crime, given his reputation, given his background in the legal profession, but also given a lot of the rhetoric on the right, support for reform in this country, which has been very critical of Starmer's position on crime and immigration as well. So this kind of combines those two issues quite neatly for him. So it feels like a moment where the rest of us might be victims of his political chess move, which is to try and prove that he is being tough.
I mean, that's what we kind of... It's one thing to be tough on crime, and who wouldn't want to see law enforcement being tough on the extreme scenes of violence that we've seen. But that is a different thing to these kind of longer term shifts for civil liberties in the country, towards surveillance and censorship. You know, there's this constant reach to digital authoritarianism. It's always there just waiting for the next crisis. And, 4 weeks into his premiership, the first crisis, we've seen 2 massive announcements on facial recognition and now the kind of dancing around the social media censorship issue, the reenactment of the Counter Disinformation Unit. These are 2 very, very significant statements that people should really be sitting up and listening to, that are cause for concern.
You shared a Times poll this morning, a public poll, of people asking them whether or not they supported the idea of removing disinformation from online platforms. But this feels another example of a kind of manufactured consent in this conversation.
I think really how a lot of people are interpreting it is, should bad things be on the internet? And the instinct is no, of course they shouldn't. But the reality is that in an environment of free speech, of course they will be. But because this is a moment of buzzwords, maybe we can simplify the language a bit. So when people talk about misinformation is untruths. And when people talk about disinformation is lies. So misinformation just means information that isn't accurate, information that's wrong. Disinformation is information that is deliberately wrong. They're 2 kind of different things, but they're things that we used to talk about as being, untrue or lies, basically. And I think if you would say, should social media companies be punished for having people posting information that isn't true on the platforms? Maybe people think about it a bit differently. I don't know. Misinformation, disinformation, it's like a Russian word. I mean, it's from the kind of propaganda playbook. It sounds really sinister and kind of contrived in a way, but we all deal and pass misinformation all the time, and we have done since the dawn of time.
Critical thinking has kind of helped us until now to deal with it.
Exactly. And, the idea, if you want to punish social media companies for having information that isn't perfectly accurate on the internet, you have to know what is perfectly accurate, which means you need to have dogma. You need to have a central arbiter of truth who is able to decide on lots of different topics what is correct and what is not correct.
There's hard power trying to penalise the platforms themselves, but there's also soft power. That's advertisers pulling their advertising from platforms like Twitter. Just this week, Elon Musk has taken out a lawsuit against a set of advertisers, including, I think it's Unilever, Mars, CVS, and some others who have boycotted, he says, illegally, Twitter because of the nature of the content that's being shared on there. I suppose I have to ask your take on that, because That is different to Keir Starmer bringing in new legislation that forces Elon Musk to remove things from his platform. But it is a kind of soft power that the advertisers have to demonetize. It's happened to us at UnHerd.
Instinctively, advertisers have the right to advertise where they want to. And Musk has been quite vocal about deliberately not wanting to be kind of advertiser-led in terms of how they run their content policies. So, yeah, I mean, it's not like, I think in the case of what happened with UnHerd and the Global Disinformation Index, it was a very cynical operation, really, to produce a judgment on a journalistic operation that wasn't true, and then to chokehold advertising. That has some really concerning implications for free speech and a free press. In this case, I think the facts are a bit different with X and advertisers not wanting to be on the platform. I think the problem that Musk has is that he's really replicating a new type of chaos in the way that he wants to operate the platform. The content policies have been all over the place. There is not a consistent view taken on what's allowed and what's not allowed. There has been a lot of stuff on there that's in clear breach of, certainly from a UK perspective, domestic law that isn't acted on. Personally, the problem that we've had with this whole debate around social media and content regulation is that people are trying to reinvent the wheel on free speech. And that basically means that free speech policies are like, passing tides, and they're moving with the political winds. And that's really not a healthy way to operate. We already have free speech frameworks in the human rights framework, and in the US in the Constitution, and we have the rule of law. And if the platforms were to observe the rule of law, and if governments were issuing, for example, legal notices about content that breach the law, we would have a much more simple and clear system. Governments are partly to blame as well as companies, because that's not what they want. They see millions and billions of people having access to information, and they want to have a say over what they can and can't see. And that's why, one of the concerning things that the Counter Disinformation Unit does is that they flag content to social media companies that breaches the terms and conditions. That means that we've got a state body that is helping to enforce foreign corporate terms and conditions rather than the law, rather than hard-won, long-fought-for guidelines on the protection of free speech that have existed since the Second World War in the case of European free speech law. That's just out the window, and now we're on with American terms and conditions.
Which are completely arbitrary, I assume, at the whim of the company.
At the whim of the company. So that does mean, now they're paying the price, because that means that if Musk says, yeah, I'm going to allow Tommy Robinson, and I'm going to allow far-right racism, and suddenly then the state goes, actually, no, we quite liked the rule of law. And equally, when Musk came up with some really arbitrary kind of censorial things, like when he started to ban people that were posting the location of his private jet, for example, is the state then supposed to say, kind of give endorsement and backing to those kinds of restrictions? Just as we've seen so many groups and communities affected by online censorship, thanks to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, content policies that are incredibly restrictive, the state has kind of aligned with those rather than pressing with the rule of law. And that's why part of the reason why we're in the terrible mess that we're in now.
One last thing before I let you go. The psychology of the population changes during these moments of crisis, sometimes irrevocably so. I definitely sensed that with COVID, that people who were rational, critical thinkers often changed and have not reverted from the position that they took during COVID, and in fact have had to double and triple down because of the kind of shame associated with admitting that one was wrong about the various censorial activities of that period. Are we going to see a similar thing here? Do you sense a shift in the psychology of the British populace from which we're going to struggle to come back from?
I think so. I think that there are people on the right and the left who are using all kinds of different explanations to justify or explain or attribute what we're seeing happening in front of us. And some of those explanations are ludicrous, and some of the instinctive responses that people are having are also irrational. And that, as you rightly say, that happens every time we have a moment of chaos. It happens in every crisis, and that's going to be a challenge. I think the challenge for us as people that want to defend civil liberties, and our most important moments are now. You know, the most important time to defend human rights and civil liberties is in times of crisis, just as the most important time to defend democracy is when it's under threat. It's not a time to say we'll start making some concessions and rolling back. You do exactly the opposite. You hold your line, because our belief is that democracy and free speech are the things that make our world a better place. And so we have to make that argument now. Some of the nicest things that I've seen over the past week, and a very dark week for Britain, was, for example, when there was a huge, quite aggressive rally outside a mosque, individuals bravely coming outside of the mosque and talking to those people, saying, "Can I talk to you? Can you tell me about your point of view?" And some of them were able to have constructive conversations with each other. And of course, they're going to disagree about some things, as anyone from different religions will disagree about things in different backgrounds. But having that kind of courage to face people that you vehemently disagree with, but have the willingness to try and find a mutual understanding. I'm not saying anyone should feel obliged to do it. People feel threatened right now and people are scared. But we have to have hope that the way to build social harmony is by talking, open engagement with people from all different backgrounds, and finding the things that we have that bring us together rather than the things that divide us. And only a country that respects and cherishes free speech can do that.
Silkie Carlo, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So that was Silkie Carlo of Big Brother Watch, laying out exactly what might happen in the coming weeks and months when it comes to surveillance, facial recognition, many of the same bugbears that we had here on UnHerd over the COVID years. And so it feels like a worrying start to the summer. Hopefully some green shoots there at the end when it comes to the idea of free speech, in fact, being the answer, not the problem in this situation. I hope that she is right, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Let us know what you thought in the comments. Thanks for watching. This was UnHerd.